Kirby Super Star isn't just a game, it's many games. To be exact, it's 7 large games and 2 smaller sub-games. While the main games follow the general gameplay of the Kirby series, they each attempt to add a gimmick on top, leading to a large variety within the usually very simple confines of the Kirby series. And this is only talking about its original release on the Super Nintendo, as its DS release, Kirby Super Star Ultra would add 4 more large games and 3 more small games. For the first part of this video, I'll primarily focus on the original Super Nintendo release, noting differences as I go until we reach the games exclusive to Ultra. But that's getting ahead of ourselves, as I'd like to go over the general main gameplay of Superstar before diving into each sub-game. Kirby is and always has tried to remain simple, and even generally easy. Kirby's moveset is basic but has a surprising amount of options. After jumping, Kirby can jump again by puffing up his little round body, and he can do this indefinitely. This move was given to him specifically to reduce the difficulty and give Kirby the easy and relaxing experience the series aims for. When exhaling, Kirby releases a small puff of air that can break blocks or moderately damage enemies. Kirby also has a slide, which can likewise be used to break blocks and damage some enemies. Kirby's other primary move is the inhale, which can be used to take in blocks, projectiles, and even one-shot small enemies. From here, Kirby can spit out whatever it is in his mouth to create a star projectile, which will have piercing properties if Kirby has 2 or more objects in his mouth. Alternatively, he can swallow, which for blocks and neutral enemies does nothing, but if the enemy he has in his mouth has an ability, such as fire, ice, Kirby will copy that ability, or if he takes in 2 enemies, Kirby can spin the roulette for a chance at any ability. These copy abilities replace his usual suction ability for a series of unique abilities. Before Superstar, these copy abilities would frequently be one attack. Fire would just be a fire breath, ice would just be an ice breath, but Superstar fleshes out most of these with their own unique movesets and sometimes even unique attributes. One fairly unique facet of the game is that Kirby can get through the entire game without ever using a power. Any enemy or boss that can't be inhaled naturally will summon an enemy or projectile that can be used as a projectile against them. There's also a block button in this game which can be used to reduce damage from hits. Interestingly, a lot of the elements introduced in Superstar, drop through platforms, simple input fighting movesets, and bubble shields would eventually be reused for another game the director Masahiro Sakurai would create, Super Smash Bros. Kirby has 24 copy abilities, 4 of which are limited use abilities, as well as 2 special abilities used in special circumstances. Bomb, as its name implies, lets Kirby throw and place bombs, which can be used from long range to defeat enemies. Cook is one of the 3 screen clears, with the unique attribute of turning all enemies on screen into food to heal Kirby. Note, for the most part, that screen clears won't one-shot bosses, and instead they'll just take a good chunk of damage out of them. The ability Copy is unique, as it allows Kirby to shoot a beam to copy enemies' abilities. This allows him to copy abilities of enemies that can't normally be copied, and in Milky Way Wishes, where Kirby can't gain copy abilities from the inhale, it can be used to work around the limitation, but there's more on that later. Fighter has one of the largest movesets, with tapped and held button presses having slightly different moves. Fighter's moves tend to be weak but come out quickly and have decent range, as well as a grab that can be used to pick up enemies and throw them at each other for very high damage. Jet works on a charge system. The more charge, the further Kirby flies, and the bigger the shockwave is when he stops. This ability also replaces his puff-up ability with a jet booster and charge that can be maintained by blocking to pull out at any time. Jet's attacks also have fire properties, allowing them to light fuses and damage enemies while charging. Mirror's attacks are fairly plain, a simple dash attack and a wall of mirrors that can deal continuous damage, but everything including Mirror's block have the added property of reflecting projectiles back to damage enemies. Ninja's primary attack is weak but fast shurikens and attacks similar to that, and can also cling to walls. Paint is another screen clear but has some slightly unique properties. It can only be obtained against 2 bosses. Against Chameleon Arm, it cancels his invisibility, allowing you to see him, and against Heavy Lobster, it covers his eyes, causing him to attack randomly instead of targeting Kirby. Plasma is a reimagining of Kirby's earlier Spark ability and is incredibly unique. As the D-pad is moved in any direction, Plasma builds a charge, and the level of charge powers up Kirby's next projectile. The reimagining of Backdrop Suplex is a grappling ability. Most of his moves result in the grab with 4 different throws that all have similar high power. Wing has a slightly different double jump, a wing flap with incredibly high airspeed, as well as attacks based around dashing and shooting feathers as weak projectiles. Yo-Yo gives Kirby a yo-yo that he can throw in any direction, acting as a long-range projectile. He can also do a sick breakdance spin that gives him invincibility. Swinging around to returning abilities from older games. Beam is a simple laser that can be charged into a piercing projectile. Crash is the most basic screen clear. Cutter lets Kirby toss a boomerang as a weapon, but also gives him a close range attack that would appear in Super Smash Bros. As his up special. Fire is a combination of 2 abilities from the past. The Flame Breath from previous iterations of Fire is still there, but the Burning ability, a flaming dash attack, has been turned into Fire's dash attack. Hammer is what it sounds like and consistently deals some of the strongest attacks in the game, especially its famous hammer flip. Hammer is also one of the 2 abilities that can knock stakes into the ground and would be seen in Kirby's moveset in Smash Bros. As well. Like with fire, ice is a combination of ice and freeze, ice being the frost breath while freeze is the area of effect freezing attack. Freeze's attacks leave enemies as ice blocks that can be kicked and slid on any surface to run over enemies. Mike is a 3-use screen clear, with each one being slightly stronger than the last. Parasol has a few basic swing attacks, but its most impressive attributes are blocking projectiles, even when just being held above Kirby, and the useless but adorable Parasol glide. Sleep is a joke ability that puts Kirby to sleep for a few seconds before disappearing. Stone turns Kirby into a stone, which makes him invincible. Stone can randomly change Kirby into a few different shapes, including Mario and Samus statues, and a few extras in Ultra, like the animal buddies and the HAL logo. Sword gives Kirby a Legend of Zelda inspired sword and outfit, as well as a variety of slashes. At full health, the slashes also shoot a laser. Wheel lets Kirby become a wheel and go incredibly fast while plowing through enemies and obstacles. When Wheel is spawned in as a helper, Kirby can ride his Wheelie Alley to turn into the Wheelie Rider, which acts the same but with jumping. I'll discuss helpers shortly. The last ability is the Star Chariot, which is used in the shoot 'em up section of Milky Way Wishes and does nothing besides let Kirby shoot lasers in said shoot 'em up section. Each ability can be sacrificed to make a helper, an AI version of the enemy that grants said power. Screen clear moves in Sleep lack partners, and some partners have slight moveset changes, like Bonkers being unable to do hammer throw and Tack having damaging moves outside of the copy ability's normal powers. On a weird side note, Capsule J becomes Capsule J2 in Ultra, likely due to the original Capsule J's resemblance to Twinbee. The Star Chariot also has a helper, but it's only available in multiplayer mode and plays exactly the same as the Star Chariot. The goal of every level is usually the same regardless of the subgame. Kirby runs through levels attempting to reach the goal. Secret areas tend to litter the levels, containing food which heals Kirby, as well as rare enemies that can be used for their copy abilities. Levels are pretty relaxed, and enemies are more so simple obstacles than necessary to be dealt with. Most levels have no form of time limit, although there can be some timed obstacles, doors that shut after a button is pressed, things like that, and there is one sub-game that features time limits on every level. This results in a very laid-back atmosphere, especially when compacted with the soft, laid-back art style and music. As always, Kirby's music is fantastic, but that and the presentation will be covered in a section on sub-games, as they tend to be fairly unique from each other in aesthetic and gameplay. Aesthetically, I do prefer Ultra, as the style Kirby adopted on the GBA and DS really captures the softness and charm of the world around him. The only real interruption to the flow of gameplay is the mini-bosses and bosses, both of which obviously require a battle to defeat. Mini-bosses tend to contain abilities that are uncommon to their areas while being fairly quick to defeat, while bosses serve to cap off most levels or sub-games as a whole and rarely give powers. The huge amount of enemies and their relative weakness makes covering them in depth unnecessary, but rest assured, the classic enemies like Waddle Dee, Waddle Doo, Gordo, and many others are still here. I'll cover mini-bosses and bosses as they come up in the individual sub-game discussions. Spring Breeze is a simple tutorial to the world of Superstar, and simultaneously a remake of Kirby's first game, Kirby's Dream Land. There are some differences from this first iteration, namely Kirby's ability to copy the abilities of his enemies, which wasn't present in Dreamland. Many levels have alterations, namely to simplify Spring Breeze to make it a better tutorial, and the level Castle Lololo is removed altogether, with its bosses Lololo and Lalala moved to Float Island, replacing Kabula entirely, although Kabula reappears in Ultra in a different subgame. While I'd love to discuss Dreamland in this video, I want this retrospective series to revolve around games I own, which means I'm going to have to pass on that for now, although I have taken a brief minute of footage from the Smash 4 Masterpiece just for comparison. Spring Breeze is far and away the most pure Kirby experience in Superstar, with a simple and relaxed aesthetic, ranging from sunny fields to relaxing beachfronts. Even the final boss area is a goofy boxing ring full of common enemies and Mario character cameos. Spring Breeze is intentionally very easy and its aesthetic perfectly matches. As Kirby games tend to have, the score is absolutely fantastic. Some of the music from Spring Breeze, which is obviously originally from Dreamland but modernized and updated for Superstar, has become some of the most popular in the franchise. Green Green's, DDD's theme, and Butter Building are some of the most remixed themes that originated here and in Spring Breeze's predecessor. The story of Spring Breeze is simple. DDD has stolen all of Dreamland's food, not for any reason, DDD is just kinda a dick. Kirby loves food and goes to get it back, and between levels there are cute little vignettes that amount to little besides making Kirby look really cute. Spring Breeze begins with Kirby's perhaps most iconic stage, Green Greens. The game attempts to wrap all the learning into very simple lessons, such as placing a wall Kirby can't jump over right at the start, tutorializing Kirby's puff-up. Midway through the level, Poppy Bros Sr., the first mid-boss, appears, and is technically the first enemy Kirby is forced to defeat. At this point, if the player is still unaware of copy abilities, they'll be forced to launch Poppy's bombs back at him, which don't explode on impact with the ground, allowing some lenience in swallowing them for use. The level ends with the iconic Wispy Woods, who is featured heavily in not only the Kirby series, appearing in next to every game, but also on multiple Smash Bros. Stages. Wispy is entirely stationary, alternating between blowing small air puffs and dropping apples on Kirby. Kirby can obviously return these apples at Wispy to damage him, but due to his stationary nature and lack of hitbox on his body, Wispy becomes one of the easiest bosses in the game, able to be destroyed in seconds with nearly any ability. Castle Lololo was the second level in Kirby's Dream Land, but it's been cut here, although elements of it are incorporated into the second level, Float Island. Much of this level features bodies of water, teaching the player about Kirby swimming, which comes up frequently, as well as his water spit ability that replaces most of his copy abilities underwater. The mid-boss here is Mr. Frosty, whose ice block projectiles don't stop moving unlike Poppy's bombs, serving as a small ramp up in difficulty. The bosses of this area are Lololo and Lalala, who are based on characters from another game from the studio behind Kirby, HAL, Lolo and Lala. The Lolo games are simple action puzzle games centered around block pushing, which is represented in this battle with Lolo and Lalala walking side to side pushing blocks. The arena is split into 3 floors, which the Lololos will walk across pushing blocks that can be sucked up and used against them, although they'll sometimes push Gordos instead, which are immune to suction. Certain abilities that can pass through floors can be used to harm them with virtually no risk of damage. Bubbly Clouds has an emphasis on pits, which while present in early levels are far more frequent here, as well as generally more vertical level design. Certainly an intentional design decision to help teach control over Puff-Up. The stage has 2 mid-bosses, Bonkers, an ape with a wide variety of attacks, including throwing explosive nuts, who when defeated grants one of the strongest abilities in the game, Hammer. Kracko Jr. is the second mid-boss, and he does little besides drift around the stage going up and down. Kracko Jr. not only drops bombs used against him, but can also spawn Waddle Doo, which can be absorbed for the beam ability if needed. The boss of the stage is Kracko, who acts similarly but with additional electric and beam attacks, and some harsh rainstorm attacks as well. Kracko is certainly the hardest boss in Spring Breeze, but Kracko Jr. is there to help teach his pattern in a safer environment beforehand. In Kirby's Dream Land, the final stage, Mount DDD, is a boss rush stage, but Spring Breeze simplifies this to being a small room with some enemies to get abilities from, and the boss battle with the king himself, DDD. DDD attacked with his hammer and jumps, a moveset that was more or less made into his Smash Bros. Moveset. When landing from a jump attack, he creates stars that can be launched back at him. Unfortunately, when DDD is hit, he has a fairly large stun window, meaning fast abilities can prevent him from moving basically at all. Once DDD is defeated, Kirby turns into a giant balloon and flies DDD's castle and all the stolen food back to Dreamland to the cheers of the citizens of Dreamland. That wraps up Spring Breeze, which unlocks Gourmet Race, Dyna Blade, and the Great Cave Offensive. Spring Breeze is fascinating. Seeing Kirby's first game shrunk down and turned into a simple learning tool works surprisingly well. The sub-game can realistically be beaten only a few minutes if aiming for speed, which is fun to go for, but it can also be fun to aim for other small challenges, like bringing a copy ability through the whole thing due to its length. It's a really great intro to the game and to the Kirby series as a whole. So how does Gourmet Race hold up? Gourmet Race, as its name implies, is a racing game. Copy abilities rarely factor in, and the subgame features no enemies, only a few pedestals called copy essences that gift abilities to Kirby and come up a lot more later. It consists of 3 stages, long linear paths lined with food. The primary mode is a Grand Prix against DDD, where Kirby must both beat him to the end and collect more food than him, but each course can also be played in time trials to improve best time. DDD's primary advantage is higher airspeed, meaning Kirby is forced to remain close to the ground to stay ahead. Gourmet Race has a unique aesthetic, with each level being based around food. While shaped as long corridors and paths, the background of levels as well as the platforms all have a moderate food theming, with lots of pinks and yellows giving the look of a cake or a sweet. The Gourmet Race theme is another absurdly popular Kirby song featured in many Kirby games and of course Smash Bros. The The song perfectly catches the energy of the area to a T. The only crime Gourmet Race commits is not having enough music, but the entire subgame lasts less than 5 minutes, so it's not that unfair. The only story given in Gourmet Race is that DDD wants to see who the hungriest gourmet is, which ain't much, but it works. Gourmet Race's first stage is the Pumpkin Grand, which is more or less a straight line with a few block walls that Kirby must slide through and a little bit of water to swim through. It's an introductory course, but even in that role it feels a touch too simple. Cornhall has a few tunnels as well as a small branching path, which doesn't matter much. Each path requires slightly different strategies, but it's still straightforward. The final stage is the Onion Grand, which is far and away the best stage. Early on in the stage, Kirby is presented with multiple essences, allowing him to take an ability with him. Jet, which is a little too unreliable due to its charge-up time. Parasol, presumably for its drifting ability, although this ability is incredibly slow. Ninja, whose wall jump is helpful in a handful of spots. Wing, which gives Kirby crazy airspeed and is far and away the most useful. And finally, Wheel, which gives Kirby crazy ground speed, but considering the verticality of the level is a little lackluster. The stage also has a lot of spikes, and as stated, verticality. Spikes don't deal damage, only a lot of stun to slow down Kirby. The game has no real ending, just Kirby holding a trophy after defeating DDD. Gourmet Race is perhaps the least interesting sub-game. Even casually, Gourmet Race takes maybe 5 minutes to beat. Some may find aiming for low times in time trials fun, but I just don't think there's enough substance in Gourmet Race. The first 2 levels don't have enough going on to be interesting, and the third is a step up because of the copy abilities, but it still doesn't feel like enough. Gourmet Race is mediocre outside of its music, but it's also short enough to not be a bother. Time to move on to a bigger game. Dyna Blade is named after its primary antagonist, Dyna Blade. Dyna Blade is like Spring Breeze, a pretty straightforward Kirby game. The game introduces a map screen, which lets Kirby play and replay levels, which is really only there due to the 2 secret areas, found by pressing buttons hidden in stages 2 and 4, as well as the roaming mini-boss encounter in stage E. The hidden areas are just rooms with every copy essence in them, allowing Kirby to more or less choose any ability he wants. Dyna Blade is also fairly unique for having only one full boss, Dyna Blade herself, with stages only being capped off by mini-bosses. Aesthetically, Dyna Blade focuses more on caves. While there are typical grassy plains, Dyna Blade tries to mix it up with more indoor mazes. Dyna Blade's music was never quite as popular as some, but is of course fantastic, especially Dyna Blade's theme. Dyna Blade herself is one of the most impressive sprites in the game, incredibly large and dynamic, and the character herself would go on to become something of a recurring character in the franchise, although not to the level of something like Meta Knight or DDD. The framework of Dyna Blade is simply that Dyna Blade has been decimating the crops of local farmers, and Kirby, being the borderline invincible demigod he is sent to solve the issue. The first level, Peanut Plains, ups the complexity a fair bit from Spring Breeze, featuring more bonus paths to healing food and copy abilities, as well as featuring path blockers with bomb blocks that may require abilities to break through. The level's mid-boss is Chef Kawasaki, called Cook Kawasaki in the SNES version. Kawasaki attacks by throwing plates, his projectile that can be used against him, and extending his frying pan for a highly damaging grab. Malu Castle primarily takes place indoors, giving it a cramped feel, and has various extra areas that require abilities to reach. Dyna Blade as a whole has more areas that Kirby without an ability can't reach. The cramped areas in Malu Castle are moderately more stressful than average, as Kirby struggles to fly over danger at any time. The stage even features an auto-scrolling section, which Kirby can get crushed in by getting caught between the screen and the wall, which is a huge advance in the stressfulness from anything in Spring Breeze. The big switch in this area requires hitting a bomb block stuck in a wall, requiring Beam, Mirror, or a similar ability that can go through walls to reach. After hitting the switch, Kirby can go to Trial Room 1 from the map screen. Bonkers appears once again, but the level also has a new mid-boss, in the Meta Knights, a group of multiple, slightly buffed enemies that are part of Meta Knight's army. While they can be swallowed, it takes a little bit longer than the average enemy, making them slightly more dangerous to dispose of. Axe Knight, Mace Knight, and Trident Knight all appear in this battle. Axe throws his axe like a boomerang or swings it repeatedly while walking forward. Mace swings his mace around above him, making him hard to approach, and Trident can either throw tridents repeatedly or cross the screen Trident first. Trial Room 1, the bonus area unlocked in Mal Castle, is 2 vertical columns of various abilities, with the top and the bottom having enemies to try out the abilities on if desired. The highlight of this room is easily the hammer. Cocoa Cave is almost nothing but a cave, the cramped hallways inside it requiring lots of head-on confrontation. There's also a small windy area that pushes Kirby right at all times, requiring a little more strategy and planning. Bugsy is the mid-boss of the area. He attacks by leaping around, charging at Kirby to grab him, which is highly damaging, and creating small bugs that fly towards Kirby to use against him. After Cocoa Cave, Stage E appears, moving around the map and forcing Kirby into completing it if he touches it. Stage E is nothing but a fight against the mid-boss Iron Mom, known as Iron Man and Ultra. Iron Man's hands can be thrown around, and she'll unleash a barrage of punches or ground slams that create stars to use against her. Completing this grants Kirby an extra life and is also necessary for full completion. Candy Mountain is a very vertical stage and relies heavily on cannons that launch Kirby after spinning, sometimes based on where the player stops the cannon. The second big switch to Trial Room 2 is found here, and the stage ends with the mid-boss rush. Bonkers, Mr. Frosty, and then 2 Poppy Bros seniors simultaneously, one after another. Trial Room 2 is horizontally laid out and lacks much of note. The subgame ends at Dyna Blade's nest, which is nothing but a small area with essences for cutter, beam, fire, and sword, followed by the boss arena. Dyna Blade has a large moveset that makes use of the various layers of the screen. Dyna can swoop in from the background, fly off screen, grab Kirby in her mouth, which is hugely damaging, or just peck at Kirby. Her only vulnerable spot is her head, which, without a power, can only be attacked with the stars she makes on landing. After defeating Dyna Blade, Kirby realizes that her destroying crop is only to feed her chicks. Kirby brings the chicks to Wispy Woods, feeding them his apples, and then teaching them to fly and befriending Dyna. Dyna Blade is a solid pure Kirby experience, and adding in the secret switches gives a little bit of an incentive for exploration, especially since the reward is getting to use abilities that haven't been available in the game before this point due to the small enemy pools. The lack of bosses is kinda a bummer, but Dyna's fight does kinda make up for it by being a little tough and having a pretty good sense of scale. It all works fairly well. Beating Dyna Blade unlocks Revenge of Meta Knight, but we'll ignore that for now and move on to the longest subgame, the Great Cave Offensive. The Great Cave Offensive, while mostly traditional in gameplay, differentiates itself through exploration. The entire map of the Great Cave Offensive is connected, with no hard level transitions, and each of its 4 areas has a number of treasures in it, which are slightly off the beaten path. There are 60 treasures in total, which may be in side rooms requiring small challenges or puzzles to retrieve. The levels themselves tend to be far more open and free in general to facilitate this focus on exploration. The only thing that the treasures do is increase completion percentage, with no extrinsic reward for completion, although each treasure is unique, and the myriad of references in them make them worth it for that alone. The real gems of the treasures are the one with Nintendo references: Captain Falcon's helmet, Donkey Kong's barrels, Screwball from Metroid, a Koopa shell, and more. Ultra replaces some of the more generic treasures with even more references: Hydra from Kirby Air Ride, the phone from Amazing Mirror, a golden water can from Animal Crossing, and others. Due to the size of the Great Cave Offensive and lack of an actual level structure, save rooms are scattered throughout the cave, allowing Kirby to heal up and leave the game if need be. Despite all taking place in a cave and having hints of that throughout, each sub-area has its own identity: a Twilight jungle theme, a blue and pink neon crystal area, a tower full of dangerous traps and lava, and a relaxing garden. Even inside these, there's tons of variants. Each boss is also large and makes great use of different effects, scaling, translucency, and others that make them very impressive, even outside of their generally large size. The Great Cave Offensive itself was iconic enough to get a stage in Super Smash Bros. Granted, It's the worst stage, but it's there. The Smash Bros. Stage also included a remix of a few of the tracks, which are all focused on the slow and mysterious pace of the Great Cave Offensive. On the story side of things, Kirby falls into a hole and wants to leave, but doesn't know how. Kirby games are rarely concerned with stories, and trying to make multiple stories is clearly not a priority for Superstar. When Kirby falls into the cave, he lands in the Subtree area. The first area is fairly linear without any major branches. Kirby will often need specific abilities to obtain treasures in this area and all subsequent areas. Using hammer or stone to nail down stakes to open new areas, cutter and ninja to cut rope platforms, and so on. Some treasures even risk being destroyed if careless, which forces Kirby to leave the area and try obtaining them again. Bonkers appears as a mid-boss in this area, but the real boss is Fatty Whale. He's a sailor whale with a giant corncob pipe and he's almost too cute to hurt. Fatty will move left and right in various patterns, from large jumps to small jumps, blowing his spout to knock rocks off the ceiling, or jumping from the background to cause a huge wave that throws Kirby in the air. The rocks he drops can be shot as projectiles at him or swallowed to gain the stone ability, which can be fairly effective against him. After defeating Fatty Whale, Kirby has a brief minecart ride to the next area, Crystal. Crystal leads off with 3 doors. The left and center door go to sub-areas mostly focused on water. One of the earliest chests in this area requires catching in water as it falls into a pit, which really sets the mood for this wet crystalline cavern. For those not seeking 100% completion, the right door can be entered immediately to move on. The correct path features a large wall of enemies, but pretty quickly leads to the boss. Computer Virus is perhaps the most unique boss in the game as it's fought in an RPG style. Computer Virus will attack and then allow Kirby a turn to attack. Kirby can launch their attacks back at them, but copy essences also appear on the edge of the screen to aid him. There are 3 stages to fight: Slime, which will rarely attack and will only launch 1 star if it does, Dancing Doll, which isn't a lot more difficult, and finally the Witch, who can go into a defense mode to reduce damage, or even shoot fire straight down. After defeat, Kirby levels up his roundness and a few other stats. This doesn't actually do anything, but it's just incredibly cute. Later appearances from this boss and other sub-games drop Slime and Doll, beginning at Witch instead, and following with 2 even stronger foes, but I'll return to that a little later. Another cart ride transitions to the next area. Old Tower is entirely skippable. For those not interested in 100%, Kirby can just walk left and exit the area, skipping the boss and the treasures and moving on to Area 4, which is a very interesting choice. The Old Tower makes a big leap in difficulty, with tons of tight and treacherous areas filled with lavas and spikes and walls of enemies, as well as a huge section gated off by needing the hammer or stone abilities. Both entrances to the Old Tower loop around to each other, which makes it very convenient to find treasure hidden inside. Old Tower has perhaps the most unique treasure, forcing Kirby to dodge sleep essences in a weird tunnel to reach it. A new mid-boss, Jukid, appears here, who fights with punches and grapples from long range, allowing him to be a big threat to close range abilities. Likewise, the boss, Chameleon Arm's tongue grab does brutal damage, while his other attacks are a little more forgiving, the roll and paint blobs. Chameleon Arm is mostly threatening due to his ability to become invisible, making predicting, dodging, and damaging Chameleon a little harder. The paint blob he spits out can be spit back at him, but alternatively can be turned into the rare paint ability, which is not only damaging, but cancels Chameleon's invisibility. Chameleon also appears in different colors, which have no impact on the fight, and a fun fact that relates to that, the paint ability also changes Chameleon's color. The final area, Garden, is much more maze-like. Like Crystal, it has 3 paths, with each one being a fairly large area with a few treasures. The Cloud area is especially messy, with semi-invisible paths leading to doors and tiny puzzles for chests in them. The Great Cave Offensive's final boss is Wham Bam Rock, and his appearance changes greatly between Superstar and Ultra. Here's a short clip of him in Ultra, something of a giant living statue, and in Superstar it's easy to see why they changed him. Wham Bam's face is immune to damage, meaning only his hands are targets, but they're also his attacks, dropping down on Kirby, punching across the stage, and dropping rocks that can be returned to him, or used to gain stone. Although stone is a pretty bad ability for Wham, since Kirby has a tough time getting above him because his hands float around. Once Wham Bam is defeated, Kirby loops back up the Subtree almost exactly where he started, where he can finally make his great escape. The Great Cave Offensive is maybe my favorite segment of the game. It's incredibly fun to find the treasures, especially the ones that really require some thought or skill to snag. The bosses are all really unique, large in scale, and fun to tackle with whatever ability Kirby has on him. The way the game forces the player to constantly swap abilities and adapt while exploring is a fantastic way to force the player to use a little of everything. Despite the fact that there's no reward for the treasures, I feel as though most players will go for all of them just to see the references that pop out of the chests, and due to the depth that the mini challenges give. I feel like the Great Cave Offensive is the most memorable subgame for most people, myself included. From the relaxed feel of the Great Cave Offensive, we'll move into one with a lot more tension. Revenge of Meta Knight has two unique focuses. The first is on story elements. Not so much story itself, as it's nothing special, but as Kirby advances along Meta Knight's ship, the Halberd, Meta Knight and his crew will have dialogue pop-ups, some pausing gameplay, others not, that are usually just small, silly conversations about what's currently happening around them. The other element is the timer. Each level has a time limit, constantly ticking down, and while not really strict, it does add some need to go fast just in case. Most of this game takes place aboard Meta Knight's airship, but despite this, it doesn't feel samey, as each segment of the ship houses unique challenges and bosses, and the game works hard to mix it up. This game is gorgeous. Revenge of Meta Knight takes place during sunset, so any outdoor area is cloaked in orange and blue. Chapter 2 even takes place on a sunset beach, and it just looks fantastic, but even the inside of the ship is so detailed and lined with windows that show the brilliant atmosphere. One of the main tracks in this mode, Meta Knight's Revenge, is far and away my favorite Kirby song, especially in its Smash Bros. Brawl remix, which plays on the stage Halberd, which is directly based on this subgame. All the music in this subgame is incredibly fast-paced to keep the player pumped on the time limits that constantly punch up the pace of Revenge of Meta Knight. The story is also existent, which is a huge leap for Superstar. Meta Knight and his Meta Knights create the Halberd, and attempt to use it to take over Dreamland, with of course Kirby being the land's only hope. Kirby lands on Halberd as it takes off and the game begins. In Chapter 1, Kirby makes a beeline for the main thrusters, attempting to take the Halberd down. Meta Knight dispatches Heavy Lobster, a giant robotic boss to be with Kirby. Kirby fights Heavy Lobster, but is quickly thrown off the Halberd before he can defeat him, ending the stage. I'll cover Heavy Lobster in more depth when he reappears. The time limit is pretty loose in this chapter, and outside of the great music and an introduction to the style of Revenge of Meta Knight with the text boxes and timer, there's not much to it. Chapter 2 is one of the two stages that don't take place on the Halberd, instead being a beach level. The timer is still here despite the relaxing theme, as Kirby needs to catch up to the Halberd before it's gone for good. A neat touch is that the Halberd appears in the background of the stage, slowly getting further away. As Revenge of Meta Knight tends to have, it also has an auto-scrolling section with an underwater section on top of that. Iron Man is a mid-boss here, and the full boss of the stage is Wispy Woods, as easy as ever. In a little twist, after defeating Wispy, Kirby goes up against Twin Woods, who are Wispy Woods but twice. On top of what Wispy can do, they also have a chance of dropping worms or Gordos instead of apples, and can also swap sections of their trunks. Each Wispy has its own health bar, and once one is defeated, the other loses the ability to swap trunks, effectively just becoming regular Wispy. Clearing the woods gives Kirby a warp star. When Kirby approaches the Halberd, he's shot down, landing on Candy Mountain from Dyna Blade, starting Chapter 3. The stage is fairly ordinary, with the only mandatory encounter being against two bonkers at the same time. Kirby rides a cannon, not launched out, but rides it to the peak of the mountain and finds Dyna Blade, still friendly with Kirby for feeding her chicks, and she agrees to fly him to the Halberd. Dyna flies Kirby to the Halberd and she's forced to retreat, leaving Kirby alone, starting Chapter 4. The deck itself is pretty straightforward, but has frequent mid-boss interruptions to run down the timer. At the end of the deck is the Combo Cannon, which you may remember from the Halberd and Brawl. Combo Cannon has a lot of tricks, shooting cannonballs, a giant laser, dropping bombs on Kirby, and even has a grab move. The cannon's hands and lasers can be damaged and destroyed, which removes the laser entirely and wards the hands off temporarily, but the only way to defeat the Combo Cannon is to lay into its central cannon. It's one of the tougher bosses in Superstar due to the amount of stuff constantly going on. After destroying the Combo Cannon, Kirby goes after the Halberd's wings. Chapter 5 is split into two segments, one for each wing. On the left wing, Kirby is dragged left by rushing wind, making the platforming over the bottomless pit that stretches across the whole area more stressful due to the amount of enemies. After defeating Mr. Frosty, thereby destroying the left wing, Kirby switches to the other side of the ship, resetting the timer. Kirby is chased by Heavy Lobster in an auto-scrolling section that should be kinda tense, but Kirby can fall behind Lobster, making him essentially immune, draining the tension unfortunately. Heavy Lobster has a few attacks when he's finally fought after the build-up, shooting mini lobsters to launch back at him, rolling across the screen and jumping, and tossing out paint blobs which give the paint ability. Paint covers Lobster's eyes when he's hit with it, causing him to attack erratically instead of targeting Kirby, which makes him easier to deal with. Kirby goes into the ship's inner workings, looking for the reactor of the Halberd. Chapter 6 switches between cramped indoor areas and short outdoor areas where Kirby needs to go against the wind to progress, as well as pressing switches for doors that close quickly after, requiring Kirby to stay moving. Reactor is a fairly simple boss that mostly attacks by creating flamethrowers, but its main attack is shooting a laser at Kirby. The reactor can only be damaged by baiting these lasers into hitting the reactor. By floating in front of the crystal, Kirby can usually avoid the flamethrowers and make the lasers a non-issue, which makes the boss fairly easy. A cute detail, the boss of the stage, Reactor, is powered by wheelies, which are freed after defeating it. With the Halberd fully compromised, Kirby moves on to take on Meta Knight. As Chapter 7 progresses, Meta Knight's crew abandons the ship. The Meta Knights attack Kirby a few times, but the main portion of this level is the fight against Meta Knight. In this battle, Kirby is forced to take a sword that Meta Knight offers him and is incapable of dropping it. Many of the moves Meta Knight uses here would become staples of his moveset and would heavily inspire his Smash design, including the first appearance of his wings. The Mach Tornado lets Meta Knight throw Kirby into the air and can't be guarded against. Much like the tornado, he can also spawn and launch. Meta Knight will also glide around and slash his sword around and shoot crescent slashes. Once Meta Knight is felled, Kirby makes his escape from the falling halberd on top of a wheelie as Meta Knight tries to attack and the ground collapses underneath, which has the intenseness the heavy lobster chase was probably meant to have. As Kirby leaps off the halberd, it crashes into the sea, ending Meta Knight's plans. Revenge of Meta Knight is fairly short, but succeeds in its pacing throughout. Revenge pushes Kirby to move quickly and constantly, using both timers and set pieces. Meta Knight's boss fight is incredibly well done, as it's balanced around the sword that Kirby is given to go against him. The dialogue is basic, but is an incredibly charming addition that adds to the quick pacing and moderately larger story Revenge tells. Revenge is a very fair contender for top spot in Kirby Super Star. With every subgame completed, the final story is unlocked, which, while not the last subgame we'll look at, is meant to be the end of the game. Milky Way Wishes has a unique gimmick to say the least. Kirby can no longer gain abilities from enemies. That doesn't mean he needs to beat everything just by spitting, but instead that copy essences can be found in each level. But they aren't regular copy essences either. They're copy essence deluxes. Touching one gives Kirby its ability permanently, allowing him to hot switch between these abilities at any time, either through the pause menu, the quick switch with the X button, or in Ultra the touchscreen. Every non-limited use ability is found somewhere in the levels of Milky Way Wishes, and much like the treasures in the Great Cave Offensive, are usually in obscure and treacherous spots. Each world in Milky Way Wishes has a unique theme, be that lava, ice, or machine, and often have unique gimmicks inside them. The theming of the levels is very strong. As they tend to be, the boss theme for the final boss of this sub-game is its best song, and while not the most commonly returning song, has also appeared in Smash Bros. The music less fits with the feeling of the game as a whole, and more so with the locations that it belongs to. When the Sun and Moon begin to fight, Kirby needs to find a way to stop them. A new character, Marks, informs Kirby that if he summons Galactic Nova, a giant clock meteor thing, he can wish for the fighting to end, sending Kirby on his adventure. Somewhat unique to Milky Way Wishes, Kirby can tackle the levels in any order he pleases. There are 6 worlds that have an intended order that slowly ramps up the difficulty, but there's no pressure to follow this guided method. There's also one hidden world, a semi-unmarked planet that isn't necessary to visit but grants a copy essence that is otherwise unobtainable. Floria, the first intended stage, probably is the most notable gimmick of the bunch. The planet itself is a basic grassy area, but going through a door will cycle seasons, which is used to remove obstacles and open alternate paths, kinda like the Zelda Oracle games. In spring, large trees will block paths and water will be wet. This is generally the default setting. Summer makes things look a little different, but it doesn't seem to have many unique attributes. During autumn, large trees will be cut down, allowing Kirby to get past them, and lastly, winter has the most dramatic changes, with piles of snow blocking off some areas entirely and water becoming ice. Doors to secrets, primarily the area's 3 abilities, Ice, Fighter, and Cutter, are usually hidden behind the seasonal transitions. Floria's boss is Twin Woods, mostly unchanged from his last appearance, although in Ultra he's given an autumnal look, which is a nice touch. Aquarius, called Aqualus in the SNES version, is a water stage, in which Kirby is frequently put in dangerous bodies of water and forced to deal with currents to traverse. Hidden in Aquarius are the Beam, Parasol, and Sword abilities. Fatty Whale's the boss here, and outside of being pink in Ultra, he's identical to Fight in the Great Cave Offensive. The Wind Planet is named after my favorite Disney movie, Sky High. Not hard to guess, but it's the cloud level. The only notable part of the level, truthfully, is the pretty tricky race against the Fuse to get a cannon for the wheel ability. The other 2 essences are Jet and Wing. Krako is the boss of this area and is unchanged outside of being kinda blue-gray in Ultra. Hot Beat is the fire-based planet. A lot of this level is covered in lava tiles that can do some serious damage, and one essence even requires Kirby to swim through it. The latter half of the level focuses heavily on minecarts, mostly using them to press down stakes and open up the path ahead. Fire and Suplex are found in this area for use. Chameleon Arm is the boss of Hot Beat, wholly unchanged. First one to guess what Cavius has as its theme wins a prize. Each room in Cavius is a slightly enclosed maze with large rooms dotting them, usually filled with a mid-boss, some of which give essences. Bomb, Hammer, and Stone are found here. Wham Bam Rock is the boss, and as all the important bosses are, he remains unchanged as always. Makai is like Halberd in planet form, down to its boss. A lot of emphasis is put on combat here, with one room being nothing but almost every mid-boss connected by elevators. Plasma and Yo-Yo are both unlocked here, and the boss is Heavy Lobster again. Heavy Lobster has a silver coat of paint in Ultra. The final normal stage is Half Moon, which has a unique and fantastic look, wandering through a starry landscape on paths made of stars. It's the most unique area in the entire package. In this odd landscape, Kirby can get Mirror and Ninja. Computer Virus reappears, but is very different. The Witch is the first stage, and he's completely unchanged, but the next two stages are new and unique. The Evil Knight can fire 5 stars in a row, freeze Kirby, which is extremely dangerous, or rain knives from the ceiling. The Red Dragon is the final phase, and he can shoot stars in a slightly offbeat pattern, throw wind blades in a circle pattern around him, slash, shoot fire, boost his defense, cause large gusts of wind that have projectiles in them that can damage Kirby, on top of having a very large health bar. Question mark, question mark, question mark, question mark is the bonus area, and can be entered at any time by going to the small cartoony star on the map. The map is a straight line, with the only obstacles being tacks and bombers. At the end is the copy ability, so it's best to go here early as copy is mostly useless after going through the rest of the levels. After completing all the main stages, not counting question mark, question mark, question mark, question mark, and flying to Nova, Marks will jump in the way and wish for control over Popstar. The final level is Galactic Nova. It begins as a scrolling shooter section in the Star Chariot, which can be done with 2 players in multiplayer, but the AI can't participate. The first boss is Galactic Nova, which is still fought in the scrolling shooter style. Kirby dips between slow-moving targets he needs to destroy. Once they're all destroyed and Galactic Nova is broken, Kirby goes to confront Marks. If you've played Smash Ultimate, you've fought Marks. He can throw boomerang crescents, plant seeds that grow into long spiny trees where they fell, shoot bombs that freeze Kirby, shoot a giant laser, pop out of a shadow in the ground, and most dangerously, split himself in half to create a black hole that deals massive damage if Kirby gets sucked into it. Marks is the most difficult and varied boss, with an amazing boss theme to match. Marks requires constant focus, and it really helps to have the ability to switch abilities at will. Once Marks is finally defeated, he's thrown into Galactic Nova, which explodes. In both versions, the credits for the whole of Superstar roll here, although both games have a little bit of continuation after. The arena in both, and a little extra in Ultra. Milky Way Wishes is one that really shines due to its gimmick. Its levels aren't nearly as complex or creative as some, but the Copy Essence Deluxe system and free ability changing allows a lot of freedom while exploring, especially given the free choice of order to tackle the stages in. While I don't like the scrolling shooter section much, Marks is a fantastic fight to end this massive package on, with fantastic music and presentation, and that odd Kirby staple of him fighting a horrific galactic end boss. The arena is what it is, 19 battles featuring every major boss in the game plus a few extras. Before entering the arena, Kirby has his pick of copy abilities, and between every battle he's placed in a rest area, where he can pick between 2 random abilities offered to him with 5 non-regenerating Maxim tomatoes. In Ultra, these Maxim tomatoes are replaced by regular tomatoes after they're picked up once. It sounds kinda like All-Star mode in Smash, huh? All-Star mode even uses the rest area theme from this game as its background track. It's pretty grueling, and a lot of the bosses in the game can be pretty harsh at times. Marks is always the last boss, but every other boss shows up in random order. The bosses are Chameleon Arm, Computer Virus, the harder version from Milky Way Wishes, Dyna Blade Fatty Whale, Galactic Nova Nucleus, Heavy Lobster, King Dedede, Kracko, Lololo, and Lalala. Mid-boss All-Stars 1, consisting of Chef Kawasaki, Bonkers, and then Bugsy, one after another, and 2, consisting of Poppy Bros Sr., Mr. Frosty, Iron Man, and Jew Kid. The Combo Cannon, Meta Knight, who offers the sword but waiting long enough allows Kirby to skip taking it. Reactor, Wispy Woods, Twin Woods, Waddle Dee, a unique joke boss that's a regular Waddle Dee with a massive health bar, who's replaced with Bandana Waddle Dee in Ultra, Wham Bam Rock, and then of course Marks. Getting through it can be pretty brutal, but that's really all there is to it. The arena is fine, it's just a bonus, but it is one required for 100% completion. Especially in the SNES version, the helpers tend to have breakdowns in bosses, being more of a burden than a help, which makes it a little more difficult. Ultra eases the difficulty a lot just by playing a little bit smoother, being a little bit snappier, and giving the extra tomatoes as well. There isn't much to it, and it doesn't add anything new. Most of these bosses have been fought at least 3 or 4 times, which means the repetitiveness shows a little in this mode. Now let's really quick look at the 2 minigames that appear in both versions. Unlocked by default in the SNES version and by beating the arena in Ultra, Megaton Punch puts Kirby against 3 opponents in a simple test of timing. Kirby is in a competition of strength with Waddle Dee, Knuckle Joe, and Big Mam, which is accomplished by, in order, pressing A to fill a bar as close to the top as possible, pressing A to line up 2 rotating crosshairs, and then pressing A one last time when a pendulum is in the center of its swing. The closer Kirby gets to these 3 alignments, the harder he punches, to the point of almost breaking Popstar in half. There are 3 difficulty levels, and in each, all 3 opponents are faced in the same order, with each being progressively stronger than the last. The game is quite simple, and even on level 3, the timing isn't strict enough to require all 3 timing challenges to be perfectly aligned. It's pretty basic even for a minigame, but the animation of the planet almost being split in half is pretty adorable, as is the Mario characters that appear in the crowd. It only lasts about a minute, so it's inoffensive, but I wouldn't call it very good. Samurai Kirby is about as small as Megaton Punch and infinitely more cruel. On SNES it's a default game, and in Ultra it's unlocked after beating Knightmare Ultra, a mode I'll talk about in a second. The gameplay is simple. When the game says to, the player presses a button as fast as they can. Kirby gets in these samurai quick draw duels with Waddle Doo, Wheelie, Chef Kawasaki, King Dedede, and Meta Knight. Each one has a faster reaction time than the last. React too slow, Kirby loses. Jump the gun and get a strike. 2 strikes and it's a loss. There are 3 difficulties that speed up the reaction times of every opponent. Even at the end of beginner mode, the reaction times get absurd. Meta Knight on easy has 11 reaction frames, about 1/6 of a second to press the button after go is called. On hard, Waddle Doo requires 18, so about 1/3 of a second, and Meta Knight goes down to 8 frames. It's harsh and difficult, and losing starts the whole chain over, meaning no redos on Meta Knight. Like Megaton Punch, it's simple and short. Unlike Megaton Punch, getting through it feels like it requires superhuman timing or really good prediction. It's not very fun for me personally, and despite its length, it does kinda offend me because it's a pain in the ass. While I'm here, it's also worth noting that Superstar was planned to have a haunted house subgame, whose name can be translated to Heat Haze Mansion, where Kirby would use a candle to get the fire ability. It was cut to prioritize other subgames, but sounds like a cute idea. It's not really relevant, I just wanted to bring it up. Kirby Superstar is a solid package. While not every subgame is equal, especially comparing the Great Cave Offensive to something like Gourmet Race. The games that are included are fun and unique enough from each other to feel like a handful of full games and some smaller games as a bonus. The game would set a lot of standards for the Kirby games, introducing many mainstay abilities, the true introduction of subgames, and even an early version of the series' eventual art style. Superstar has an impressive legacy too. For example, a lot of the elements of Smash Bros, like the shields, fall through platforms, and simple fighting game moveset, outside of the game itself having many references in the movesets and stages. The game has also been re-released multiple times on the Wii and Wii U Virtual Console, on Kirby's Dream Collection Special Edition on the Wii, as part of the Super Nintendo Classic System, and most recently on Nintendo Switch Online. Samurai Kirby and Megaton Punch were available on the Super Famicom Satellaview expansion in a game called Kirby's Toy Box. Great Cave Offensive was a masterpiece in Smash for Wii U, and as a demo in Amiibo Tap, and of course being remade with new content for the DS as... Kirby Super Star Ultra isn't just a remake, it's a full overhaul. The game switches to the engine and graphics used in the GBA and DS era of Kirby. Not only are the graphics bouncy, round, and adorable, but the gameplay is made a good step faster, more responsive, and snappier. While stone was more or less unusable in Superstar due to the delay between exhaling a puff and turning to stone, in Ultra it's almost instantaneous. Being so adorable, snappy, and responsive would make Ultra worth it in itself, but it also gives us new games with even more unique styles. There's a few changes to the old games as well, mostly in the script for Revenge of Meta Knight and the items found in the Great Cave Offensive, which feature more modern references to replace some of the more generic items, but the changes overall are very minor. I'll gush more soon, but first let's move into the new content. Revenge of the King is designed to be a more challenging version of Spring Breeze. Much like Spring Breeze is a remake of Dreamland, Revenge of the King is a semi-remake of the extra game in Dreamland. While the layout remains mostly the same, areas will often have small changes to increase the difficulty, health restoring items are far more scarce, and enemies and bosses are replaced by more aggressive, dangerous versions of themselves. The story serves as a follow-up to Spring Breeze. DDD steals the sparkling stars and readies himself to rematch Kirby. Aesthetically, Revenge of the King is designed to look a lot like Spring Breeze. All the areas are essentially the same, but they've all changed a fair amount as well. The aesthetic is very nice and fitting. It essentially serves to twist Spring Breeze's laid-back atmosphere into one that's a little more harsh and unfriendly, which is a really nice touch. There isn't a lot of new music, but the new DDD theme is incredibly good as well. The first stage is Purple Plants, a more dangerous version of Green Greens. The familiar enemies of Spring Breeze have been replaced, for example, Cappies become Poison Mashes. The mid-boss of the stage is Fan Fan, a rolling elephant who throws out apples and grabs Kirby when he gets close. The mid-boss, if nothing else, serves as a warning to the increased difficulty of Revenge of the King. Replacing Wispy Woods is Wispy's Revenge. Revenge's air puffs become slightly stronger tornadoes, some of his apples are poisoned, damaging Kirby when inhaled, and he drops worms. Like Wispy Woods, his threat is minimal due to struggling to hit Kirby if he simply hugs his base, but again it's more of an indication of things to come. Illusion Islands are an evolution of Float Islands, and like its predecessor, focus heavily on water. Two new mid-bosses appear here, Fire Lion, who is a Fire Lion. He can grab Kirby when close, which is brutal, dash around while on fire, or make an awkward leap in the air, giving Kirby stars to throw back at him. Mr. TikTok is a giant walking clock. He can ring, a short-range attack that makes him immune to projectiles, or throw around musical notes, which usually don't come close to hitting. Mr. TikTok is pretty much the joke mid-boss of this area, but Fireline is pretty threatening. The boss of the level is Lololo and Lalala's Revenge. Like their non-revenge forms, they're still more or less a joke. Gordos will sometimes move along the rows independently, and there are now 4 rows instead of 3, and they might be a little bit faster, but the differences are pretty minor. Level 3, Crash Clouds, is Bubbly Cloud's more intense cousin. Again, there are 2 new mid-bosses. Grand Wheelie is a giant wheelie. He can spawn smaller wheelies and drives back and forth. In short, he's not a threat. Kracko Jr. comes back as, you guessed it, Kracko Jr.'s Revenge. Kracko Jr.'s Revenge actually lives up to his name. He's faster in general, but also has new movement patterns, including tracing the edges of the screen, which is surprisingly difficult to cope with at times. Surprisingly, the older Kracko's Revenge has far less drastic changes. Kracko's Revenge is moderately faster, but only has one new move, an easily avoided lightning strike from center stage. A new stage appears here, Mount DDD's Sky. To call it new is slightly misleading though, as it's both only a boss stage and something that was kinda in Dreamland. The only obstacle in the stage is Kabula, a boss from Dreamland who was cut from Spring Breeze. In Dreamland, she was only able to shoot her cannon or charge Kirby, but here with a fresh design, she can also shoot out Gordos, which unlike cannon fire can't be destroyed by Kirby's bullets, and firing large missiles in predictable patterns. In Dreamland, she was fought by giving Kirby an infinite puff, but here she's fought in a star chariot like in Milky Way Wishes. After she's destroyed, Kirby arrives at Castle DDD. The final chapter is the Revenge. Unlike Spring Breeze, which only had DDD as a boss, the Revenge borrows from Dreamland, starting with a mid-boss rush. The 4 new mid-bosses, excluding Kracko Jr. appear, as well as Bandana Waddle Dee, a recent favorite from the Kirby fandom. Bandana Dee acts like the Waddle Dee in the arena of the original game, and in fact replaces him in Ultra's arena. The stage has some Return of Meta Knight type dialogue boxes, which have a very cute interaction with DDD dismissing Bandana Dee, but him going to fight Kirby anyway, which is absolutely adorable. Once Kirby fights his way to the boss room, he finds the arena slightly changed from Spring Breeze. The walls and ceiling of the area are electrified, and the only remaining audience member is Bandana Dee. Since the floors and walls are electrified, it's way harder for Kirby to just float around and avoid all of DDD's attacks. Kirby is also given a hammer, matching Meta Knight's offering of a sword. DDD himself is no more, instead replaced by Mass DDD. His jump move that inspired his Smash Bros. Up special is now done 3 times in a row instead of only 1. He can do a hammer spin that lasts a long time, requiring Kirby to find a small area between the giant swings and electric fences. DDD's hammer can also shoot flames and missiles now, and other moves have all their small added effects, like the hammer slam shooting out shockwaves. On top of this, DDD is hardier and stronger than usual. After his defeat, DDD's mask breaks and he's launched away, as he, as well as Bandana Dee and his other loyal servants, walk into the sunset defeated. Revenge of the King is a great first foot forward for Ultra. Much like Spring Breeze ushered in Superstar, this game ushers in Ultra's new modes and their focus on difficulty very well. Even though it lacks a real central gimmick, the familiarity and difficulty make an odd and wonderful contrast. It ain't Dark Souls, but being forced to live off almost no healing while trying to avoid damage from far more aggressive enemies is very exciting, and the reintroduction of Kabula is a nice touch. Revenge of the King is the perfect escalation of the difficulty of the rest of the sub-games, but the next game is Ultra's real standout. After beating Revenge of the King, Meta Knightmare Ultra is unlocked. Meta Knightmare Ultra casts Meta Knight as our new player character as he goes through slightly truncated versions of all the previous sub-games. As he can't copy abilities, Meta Knight is given a new way to get ahead. Firstly, his moveset is a slightly upgraded version of Sword with an extra upward slash, but with the movement of the wing ability. With every kill, Meta Knight gains a small amount of energy, usually about 2 for regular enemies and 5 for mid-bosses, and quite a bit from bosses up to 50. Meta Knight can spend this at any time using commands on the touchscreen. For 2, you can use Night Call, which summons a helper, either Blade Knight, the regular sword helper, or Sword Knight, who has Meta Knight's additional move at random. Meta Quick costs 8 and increases Meta Knight's movement speed, which is nice but not incredibly useful most of the time. Heal acts as a full heal for Meta Knight and his helper for 10. Lastly, he has Mach Tornado, a screen nuke that eats up 30 energy and shreds bosses. Due to his ability to self-heal, food is entirely absent from Knightmare. Meta Knightmare Ultra has very little story, just showing Meta Knight go to places Kirby went, clearing them out and leaving, including strangely enough destroying his own halberd. Towards the end, there's a small twist on the story of Milky Way Wishes. Level 1 is Spring Breeze and follows the entire segment faithfully. As previously stated, healing items are mostly gone, but as before he fights all the same bosses and enemies, Wispy, DDD, and so on. The biggest change is that the previously separate stages within Spring Breeze have more or less been smoothed into one large stage, with only one checkpoint coming after taking down DDD. After defeating DDD, Meta Knight flies to the next game. Dyna Blade appears with a few changes as the second stage. The giant switches and extra rooms have been removed as there is no longer a world map and Meta Knight gains nothing from the extra rooms. Level E, where Big Mam is fought, becomes mandatory, stuck right before the final stage. Again, the stage has been smoothed into one large level. After taking down Dyna Blade, Meta Knight flies into a hole in the ground. The third stage is the Great Cave Offensive, which has many major changes. All of the treasure normally spread around the various areas of the cave are now gone, and most of the optional paths have been sealed off. While most of these were small circular areas, the entirety of the castle, as well as Camellia Arm, are skipped outright. With these distractions removed, the Great Cave Offensive becomes far shorter and more straightforward. After defeating Wham Bam Rock, Meta Knight flies to freedom. The fourth level is strangely enough the Revenge of Meta Knight. Meta Knight goes through his own ship and sabotages it, taking it down. The cutscenes and text boxes from Kirby's version are gone, as they obviously would make little sense, as well as the fight against Meta Knight for even more apparent reasons, simply ending when Meta Knight takes out the reactor. Meta Knight watches his own ship sink into the sea and then moves on to the final stage. The final stage is Milky Way Wishes. Again, the world map is removed with the stages being played through in their intended order, with the stages question mark, the copy Essence era, and the scrolling shooter segment being removed outright. After reaching Nova, Meta Knight makes his wish to fight the strongest warrior in the galaxy. Marx is entirely absent, instead being replaced with the ferocious Galactonite. Galactonite resists the Mach Tornado, requiring a fully fair fight. Galactonite has moves very similar to Meta Knight, a rapid strike, the large screen crossing tornadoes, the plunging stab, but also new dangerous moves, such as a beam that travels across the screen from the center in a circular pattern, requiring fast thinking and faster movement, as well as occasionally spawning in Meta Knights that need to be defeated to return Galactus to the fight. After besting Galactonite, Meta Knight finally becomes the strongest warrior in the galaxy. Meta Knightmare Ultra is a great bonus mode. Meta Knight feels appropriately distinct, and the focus on speed and resource management make it feel very fresh, despite more or less forcing the player to run through reused content. The only real issue I see with Meta Knightmare Ultra is that it seems too easy for being the final main game unlocked. Outside of Galacta, who resists crash damage, most bosses crumble to Mach Tornado. Food is absent, which sounds tough, but killing a few enemies, who keep in mind are very rarely threatening in this game at all, gives ample energy to allow Meta Knight to full heal at almost any opportunity he'd need, up to 5 times in a row no less. The mode is fun for what it is, but seems like an excuse to give a fan favorite character the spotlight for a bit. This mode does have some legacy though, as Galactonite would go on to be a recurring character in the series from this point. Helper to Hero is another arena unlocked after beating Meta Knightmare Ultra. Like Meta Knightmare Ultra, the focus is shifted away from Kirby, this time onto his helpers. Each of Kirby's helpers along with Sword Knight from Meta Knightmare Ultra are allowed to run through this gauntlet. Most of the helpers are identical to Kirby, although instead of having puff up, they instead have infinite jump, which is more affected by momentum and weakens with each mid-air jump. On top of this, some of the helpers have missing moves or bonus attributes. Plasma Wisp floats instead of walking or jumping and can freely move in any direction, and with this his shield can also be used in the air. Bonkers, the hammer helper, is larger than Kirby as a mini-boss and has a slightly different hammer flip, as well as being unable to use hammer tosses. When Kirby uses it, it removes his ability. Bugsy, the suplex helper, is a mid-boss and therefore also slightly larger than Kirby. And lastly, Tack, the copy helper, has a unique moveset from the copy ability altogether. His standard attack is a punch that steals copy abilities in the main games, but doesn't work in this mode. Holding the button gives him a charge punch with more power and range. Tack's block also makes him completely intangible. While Kirby and other helpers are pushed around by attacks while blocking and take chip damage, all enemies and attacks will pass through Tack while blocking, allowing some exceptional cheese. Unlike the arena, there's no randomization in Helper to Hero. Every time will be the same for every helper. Wispy Woods, mid-bosses 1, Chef Kawasaki, Bonkers, and Bugsy, the Milky Way Wishes version of Kracko, King DDD, Dyna Blade, Milky Way Fatty Whale, Milky Way Camelio Arm, mid-bosses 2, Poppy Rose Sr., Mr. Frosty, Iron Man, Jukid, Milky Way Twin Woods, Milky Way Heavy Lobster, Milky Way Computer Virus, Meta Knight, Milky Way Wham Bam Rock, and a new boss, Wham Bam Jewel. Jewel is mostly the same as Rock. He's bulkier, hits harder, and acts a little faster. His regular fist pound has a wiggle when raising to throw off aerial attacks. He has a screen-crossing blazing fist attack, and he can shoot lasers from his finger guns, and most importantly, he becomes racist again. He's a pretty tough boss for most helpers, especially given the limited option of some of the helpers and the inability to switch strategies on the fly like Kirby can, which makes him a real wall at times. Thankfully, for 100% completion and unlocking the true arena, Helper to Hero only needs to be beaten once, allowing the player to choose the helper that suits them best. The only reward for completing Helper to Hero is a video compilation of the cutscenes from the Super Nintendo version of Superstar, so it's not going to be worth it for most people. Helper to Hero is a good challenge mode, forcing the player to learn the in and outs of each helper and severely limiting the options of the player. This can also be a bad thing though, as some helpers like Wheelie are really boring and awkward for bosses, unfortunately. The lack of randomness is a good change. It allows better planning and prep for heals, and the routine makes the early fights become less and less of an issue over time, which allows more experimenting with every helper. There's something admirable about the setup of Helper to Hero, despite it being another arena, and getting to play as the helpers without multiplayer is a nice bonus, but I wouldn't call it great. The true arena is the arena for masochists. That's the pitch more or less. The true arena is only 10 fights long, featuring the new bosses introduced in Ultra, as well as a new finalist final boss. On top of that, there are no maximum tomatoes, only 5 regular tomatoes, and while Kirby has free pick of ability at the start, he only has one option to switch to between battles. The first 6 fights are randomized, all the bosses from Revenge of the King. Wispy's Revenge, Lololo and Lala's Revenge, Kracko Jr.'s Revenge, Kracko's Revenge, Kabula, and the true mid-boss all-stars, Mr. TikTok, Grand Wheelie, Fan, and Fire Lion. The last 4 appear in a set order: Mass DDD, Wham Bam Jewel, Galactonite, and the new Mark's Soul, shown in a cutscene before his fight to be the zombified version of Mark's, reincarnated by colliding with the remains of Nova. Mark's Soul is, as expected, far bulkier with about twice the health, faster, harder hitting, and packing some new tricks. His 2 new big attacks are a rain of paint blobs that speed up as they go on that can give Kirby the paint ability, and a giant energy ball that travels right across the bottom of the stage and left across the top, or vice versa. Once defeated, Kirby is officially best of the game, granting him 100% completion. The true arena is a fun final challenge, and even as the shortest arena is certainly the most difficult, downright cruel at times, especially considering most of these bosses outside of Wham Bam Jewel have only been fought once at this point, depending on the player's persistence in Helper to Hero, as unlike the bosses from the Super Nintendo game, they don't have any reappearances, meaning their patterns are likely far less memorized by the player. The gauntlet is fun and tough, and difficult to cheese due to the boss variety and lack of options. The true arena, despite being the game's 3rd arena, is the perfect end cap to Ultra's lineup. Before we go though, Ultra has a few new minigames to discuss as well. Kirby Card Swipe is a simple sub-game, and like all the new ones seems to have been made strongly with multiplayer in mind, featuring competitive play against other Kirby, even when alone. Card Swipe has a very simple gameplay system. The top screen displays a card, and the players try to tap the matching card on the bottom screen before the others can. The 3 levels give the AI faster reactions. The game isn't great, being a little too simple and plain, but the art direction of a very Japanese Kirby is cute, just like in Samurai Kirby. This one doesn't emulate very well, as tapping a touchscreen is far easier and faster than moving a mouse quickly and accurately and clicking on things in the very short time frames allotted. Kirby on the Draw is a cowboy-styled light gun game. Cutouts of enemies appear in the bottom screen, some worth slightly more than others, as well as bombers that drain points. All 4 Kirbys race to get as many points as possible. It's simple and fun, and on actual hardware is really fast paced, but again, due to its high speed, it's a lot tougher emulated. There isn't much to it, but it works really well as a short distraction. Snack Tracks is my personal favorite of the new minigames. Food rolls down from the top screen to the bottom and into Kirby's mouth, and the player must tap worms, which can also be found in food, rocks that need 2 taps, and bombs that are launched to other players when tapped to keep Kirby's conveyor belt clean and get his belly full. The game is fast-paced without being dependent on split-second reaction timing like Samurai Kirby, and the bomb sabotage, while not being able to be strategic, is a fun way to mess with opponents' flow. Due to the food traveling down from the top of the screen, it's also possible to see things ahead of time and plan taps and strategies, and on top of that, it emulates well as it doesn't require precise movement, only precise clicking. It's a pretty solid minigame, and perhaps the best out of all of them, the throwback minigames included. And with that, it's finally the end. That's every new game Ultra has to offer. So how is Ultra? In my opinion, it surpasses the original wholesale, not even just due to the extras, although they help, but being built in the GBA-era engine is a massive upgrade. There's a slight edge in general speed, responsiveness, and I think it's much stronger visually, not to discredit the original, but the GBA styles just peak Kirby art style to me. The perfect cute representation of Kirby. The extras are largely partially recycled, but I feel the 2 big new games really tie everything together. The new bosses, the focus on challenge, it all comes together so nicely and feels like such a natural addition. There's solid bonus features on both versions with a theater and a music player as well. Both versions are great value, filled to the brim with variety. Introducing co-op is also great because the game has various sub-games of different difficulties that allow people to play the game together, not only as an introduction to video games, but to support each other through the harder stuff. Kirby Super Star and Ultra are both fantastic games outright, whose legacy has shaped the series as it is now, as well as games outside of the franchise.